Hi, you're watching Meet the Professors. We're on location today at the UC Irvine School of Law with founding dean Erwin Chemerinsky and architect Clark Stevens. Erwin Chemerinsky is, of course, the founding dean of UC Irvine School of Law, and Clark Stevens is an architect and conservationist who has designed environmentally friendly solutions in ecologically critical places such as Malibu and the Santa Monica Mountains. He was the architect for the Malibu Lagoon Restoration Project and is currently working on the Liberty Canyon Wildlife Overpass, which will be the largest overpass built for animals in the world and will give animals safe passage throughout the Santa Monica Mountains. Clark has taught at a number of universities, including the University of Pennsylvania, USC, and UCLA. Thank you, Clark, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you again, Erwin, for letting us use your beautiful school.
My pleasure. You're always welcome.
Thank you. We're here to talk about Proposition 13, which has been quite controversial for a very long time now. It was passed in 1978. And just a general question for Erwin. How was it passed? How was Prop 13, how did it get on the ballot?
California, like many states, especially in the West, allows voters to adopt laws and even to amend the state constitution through the initiative process. And Prop 13 was an initiative passed by the voters that limits property taxes in the state.
But why was it passed? What was going on in California that gave rise to the taxpayer revolt, as they call it?
I think there was frustration. What was perceived as very high tax rates, and there was a desire to limit taxes. A group called the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association played a key role in this, and so the voters permanently limited the nature of the property taxes in the state.
And so some of the things that happened was basically property tax was limited to 1%.
1% of the assessed valuation at the time of purchase.
And the assessed valuation is frozen at the time of purchase. It's called the acquisition value. And then, does it get reassessed, or what triggers a reassessment?
There certainly can be reassessment, but the key is that you're focusing on the time of purchase. So this can lead to tremendous inequities. When I lived in Los Angeles, I bought my house in 1989, but my neighbor had purchased a house that was worth basically the same amount 20 years earlier. Well, my property taxes were hugely more than my next door neighbor's, and somebody who came in and purchased a house later was paying far more in property tax than I was, even though our houses were of the same size, even though they had the same value.
Right. And to be clear, it's a 1% maximum tax. The tax cannot go up, the assessed value cannot go up more than 2% per year, regardless of what the market's doing. And by the way, since 1978, the property values have gone up on average about 7 to 7.5% per year. And then the property value cannot be reassessed unless one of two things happens. One is a sale of the house, and the other is construction. So one of my questions for Clark is, what has this done to construction? I mean, I can tell you just in a nutshell what I've seen in Malibu is that people are not getting permits. They're not getting permits for construction because they don't want to pay more taxes. So everything's being done, behind the scenes, without government inspections, without permits, because they don't want to trigger a reassessment. Have you seen that as an architect in the building field? How have you seen Prop 13 affect building or permits?
I've seen the effects you're describing. We could talk about that. The extent to which Prop 13 is a part of that, I might not agree with you there. I think Prop 13, the problem with the housing market, and I'm mostly familiar with the western Los Angeles area, which is the Santa Monica Mountains, Malibu, Topanga, Calabasas, right? These are all higher-end markets with, in some cases, remarkably low-end construction value and real problems. The key to that situation, though, is, I think, uncertainty. Mm-hmm. I have to say one thing about Prop 13 is that it's certain. When you buy a house there, and I can use my examples as well, you're a recent newcomer. First of all, I'm from the Midwest, we're a little waspy, so don't want to ask other people what they're paying in their taxes. So it was never a consideration when I bought my house in '93 to look at what anyone else was going to do. I was trying to figure out how I was going to come up with a down payment and make those payments. And, because you're escrowing, you understand what your property taxes are going to be, and you look at that. And the nice thing about Proposition 13 is, okay, that's what it's going to be. And it's really not for a buyer in the early 90s. It was not a huge consideration for me, and it's not something I hear people talk about. What they talk about and complain about is this stew of uncertainty that comes from well-meaning but obscure and unevenly applied regulatory considerations. It's true there's a culture of violation that, in my experience, the better intended our regulations are and the newer they are, the more likely they are not to be complied with. Right. We've reached this point where I was reading something trying to get prepared for this because I'm not the attorney here in this group. Just, what is Prop 13? What does it do? And somebody made the comment in one of these articles that the only legal document, founding document, and guiding document that is longer than California's is that of India. And I think in the Santa Monica Mountains, which is western Los Angeles County, where you have these city overlays, local overlays, and state overlays, people just don't know what they're getting into, and they are literally afraid to comply with the law because they just don't know where they're out of compliance, and it's sort of like setting a fuse, and they're afraid the whole thing's going to blow up. So people do whatever they can, and when you shop for a house, I was shocked, young idealist architect, I'm doing my due diligence. I could not find a single property in my price range that had fully permitted construction. That doesn't mean it's illegal. That's an important distinction too. Unpermitted construction doesn't mean it's illegal, it means you didn't pull a permit. So in that sense, you didn't follow the regulations and require, but oftentimes you're perfectly well in compliance, you may well be.
You mean with the actual
regulation, right?
Building code. But the thing is, you still could be prosecuted for not having a permit in place.
That's right, and the action that would be required of you is to get permitted.
Right.
Right. So this is important too because it's another thing that leads to guerrilla tactics in construction. I had a client, remain unnamed, one of my first projects in LA, where he hired us to design a very unique residential project that involved pieces of an industrial building and leftovers. And it was very unusual, and we were very excited about it. We thought we were about 10% through the design when he said, okay, finish that, we're ready to build. And we said, well, wait a minute. No, there's all these documents we have to finish. Mm-hmm. You have to take them, you have to get your permits, right? You got to do all that. And he said to me, he said, just because it's not permitted doesn't mean it isn't legally designed. I over-design everything. My engineer will take this, will make sure it's in full compliance, and then it's less costly for me to have my attorneys handle the phone call when the phone call comes and show my documentation than it is to wait in line, pay the fees, and ask permission. So it's the ask forgiveness versus permission.
Well,
approach.
I mean, this is the thing. I see both sides of it. I just got a new tax bill from King County, Washington, and they have reassessed my house at 14.7% higher than it was last year. So in 1 year, 14.7%. So I do see both sides, but for me, I see a lot more downside with what Prop 13 has done. And for example, one of the things that I was just shocked about, and I couldn't believe when I read it, was that a house, no matter what it's worth, 50 million, 100 million, what, it can be transferred to a child, then to that child's child, and that child's child in perpetuity, forever. And it's never reassessed for tax purposes. Now that to me sounds like some kind of a caste system. I mean, I realize there's inheritances and all that. And by the way, California has no inheritance tax anymore either, a gift tax. So basically, people who have money now, people who own houses now, can keep them in the family for generation after generation after generation, and newcomers that have a hard time buying a house because it really it affects the market. And Erwin, a question for you: what are property taxes used for?
Well, most importantly, property taxes fund the schools. And in California, property tax is probably the largest source of revenue for the schools. And Proposition 13 has had a devastating effect on the funds that are available for schools in California. Most estimates put California among the bottom 5 states in per pupil expenditures. This is a very wealthy state with tremendous resources, but Proposition 13 has limited property taxes and therefore limited what's available to spend on education.
Right. Between 1978, when Proposition 13 was passed, to 2009, the state of California lost $528 billion in tax revenues. It's a lot of money. And I read also that our schools were about top 5, and now they're at the bottom 5 in the country. So they were at the very top or close to the top before Prop 13 was passed, and now they're at the very bottom. So what else?
Can I back up to that?
Yes.
And of
yes.
course, we need to talk about what that means. For parents who have the resources to send their children to private school, they don't need to worry about what Proposition 13 has done to the public schools. So what we've done is create a caste system with regard to the schools, much like what exists with regard to medicine. If you're poor, you go to the public hospital, but if you've got the resources and you can afford not to, you go to your private doctor. Well, for parents who have the resources, they send their children to the private or the parochial schools, and the public schools are inadequately funded. Also, there's tremendous differences in the state that there's not supposed to be among the public school systems. There's a difference between what's spent in the Beverly Hills school system compared to the Los Angeles public school system. And even within the Los Angeles public school system, there's differences based on parent contributions. Remember when I lived in Los Angeles, my kids started at the local public school for kindergarten and first grade, and then they went to a magnet school. Well, there was far more parent resources at the magnet school to buy things for the school. So tremendous inequities existed based on what parents were willing to put into the schools. So all of this has been a system that's inadequately funded overall and tremendously favors the wealthy over those who are poor.
And the people who got here first to California. I mean, those of us who went wherever we had to go to make the money we had to make to be able to come back and live in California, we're the ones being hurt. I'm going to get back to that in a minute in the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which I think is a problem. But I wanted to ask you another question for Erwin is, we hear about how taxes were rising so quickly, and that's why one of the reasons why Proposition 13 was created, and elderly were actually being forced out of their homes because they couldn't afford the taxes, and that doesn't seem right. Another reason given for Proposition 13 is Serrano versus Priest. And can you tell us what was Serrano versus Priest, and what did that mean?
Well, Serrano versus Priest was an enormously important decision. It's of the California Supreme Court. It was about 1974. And it said that disparities in school funding in California violated the California Constitution. And so that if you're in the same metropolitan area, the amount that's spent on education shouldn't depend on the wealth of the area. The problem with using property taxes to fund schools is that poor areas would have taxed at a very high rate of assessed valuation and still would have little to spend on schools. Wealthy areas could tax at a much lower rate, but have much more to spend on schools. Serrano versus Priest was to say that was unconstitutional. The problem has been administering Serrano versus Priest, because we know now, let's say, compare the Compton public schools and the Beverly Hills public schools. Right. There's a huge difference in the amount that's spent. There's an enormous difference in the quality of education.
Right. But the idea behind Serrano versus Priest was to equalize more or less expenditures in public schools throughout the area, as opposed to just within neighborhoods based on the taxes in those areas, like, again, Beverly Hills versus Compton or something like that. And, again, some of the parents may not have liked it when it was okay when we're paying all these property taxes for our children's schools, but now that's being equalized, I mean, that is I think it's maybe one of the instigating factors for Proposition 13.
Well, and of course, for those parents who send their children to private and parochial school, right, they have no incentive, right, other than egalitarianism to fund the public schools. Mm-hmm. I have said that if we really wanted to create high-quality public schools in the United States, we should require that every child go to a public school, and they'd be metropolitan-wide public schools, because then every parent would have an incentive to make sure the public schools were adequately funded. It would be unconstitutional under current law. It would be incredibly unpopular. But anything other than that begins the path towards what we have today, tremendously separate and unequal schools.
And another question for Erwin. Proposition 13 was challenged in a case called Norlinger versus Hahn. And can you just briefly describe what that case was about and what the Supreme Court said?
Norlinger versus Hahn focused on the inequity that we've been discussing. The fact that two people with houses next to each other could pay vastly different property taxes, even if the houses were the same value, because the property taxes are based on purchase price. And there were the examples before the Supreme Court of enormous disparities just because one person bought the house in 1970 and another bought the house in 1995. But the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, upheld Proposition 13. The Supreme Court basically said, we don't want the courts to get involved with regard to the equity of taxes. There's something inherently arbitrary about wherever you draw the line with regard to taxes, and we're going to let the government do this.
Well, now, Norlinger also brought a claim under basically the right to travel clause, the privileges and immunities clause, and that was not allowed to be heard because she moved from a rental apartment in Los Angeles County to a house in Los Angeles County, and so she didn't really travel. The right to explain briefly the right to travel and how serious the right to travel is taken under the U.S. Constitution.
The right to travel is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, but the Supreme Court has said that the right to travel is a fundamental right. But what the court has focused on with regard to the right to travel is really interstate travel and migration. The most famous case was one called Shapiro versus Thompson in 1970, where Pennsylvania had a law that said in order to get welfare benefits in the state, you had to be a resident of the state for a year. And the Supreme Court said, well, that would discourage interstate travel and migration. That violates the Constitution. If the California law treated out-of-staters differently than in-staters, then you could bring a claim with regard to the right to travel. But when it's just somebody within California moving from one place to another, the right to travel is not implicated.
Another question for Erwin Chemerinsky. Do you think it would be possible to bring a privileges and immunities clause challenge to Proposition 13 based on the right to travel if someone, say, were to move to California for work purposes, maybe being transferred in the military or something, and now here they are in California, and they have to pay much higher taxes than their neighbors. And another part of that question also is, doesn't this discourage people from coming to California who might otherwise come? And isn't that fundamentally against the idea behind the right to travel?
You referred to the privileges or immunities clause of the 14th Amendment. It has majestic language. It says no state can deprive any citizen of the privileges or immunities of United States citizenship. But since it was adopted in 1868, there's only been one Supreme Court case ever that has not been overruled that has found a violation of the clause. So to begin with, you're dealing with a provision that is incredibly rarely used. But besides that, it applies only if a state is discriminating against out-of-staters. Somebody who's always lived in California and buys their first house is treated the same as somebody who moves to California from another state. So imagine two people who were born in 1960, one in California who's always lived here, one who's born in another state who just moved here. And imagine each of them buy their first house in 2016. They are treated exactly the same way because there's not discrimination against out-of-staters compared to in-staters. The discrimination is against new purchasers opposed to long-ago purchasers. It doesn't implicate the privilege of immunities clause.
But doesn't that have the practical effect of causing people not to come to California, not to exercise their right to travel? Because if they come here, they're going to get whacked with taxes that are far in excess of their neighbors with similar houses.
It might have that effect, but since the law is treating in-staters the same as out-of-staters, it wouldn't. Let's take the bar exam as an example. If somebody who lives in California wants to be a member of the bar, they have to take the bar exam. If somebody from out of state wants to come be a member of the California bar, they have to take the bar exam. Well, it might discourage people from moving into the state, but it doesn't violate the Constitution. It's treating in-staters and out-of-staters alike.
And this is, I guess, a question for Clark. It seems to me that when construction triggers a reassessment for tax purposes and a person may be locked into 1975 tax assessment, they're not going to get permits to do new work on the house, which makes me wonder, is that going to make the house less safe? For example, electricity can be very dangerous, especially in the Santa Monica Mountains where it's so dry and Malibu's on flames, every few years. Has you seen that happen? Are people avoiding getting permits and doing construction the right way because they don't want to trigger a reassessment under Proposition 13?
They are avoiding permits for a number of reasons. I have to say, most likely the least of which is Prop 13. It's what happens, and you're very correct in saying it. I work a lot out of state as well. I work in rural areas, and typically the two things that you are required to permit are the things that can affect your neighbors. One is electricity. If you set your neighborhood or your rangeland, if you're somewhere rural, on fire, you risk everybody else.
Of course.
If your on-site wastewater treatment system, your wastewater treatment system is not done correctly, you can contaminate everybody's water supply. So those two things are always regulated, and when it's limited to that, there are no cheaters. Again, the complexity here is there are two things going on, and again, I can only speak to certain markets within California where I've worked, and I haven't seen analysis of this. But what I see happening is that in the Santa Monica Mountains, where your situation is, you have a marketplace that the purchase point is incredibly confusing because there's a great deal of well-intentioned disclosure documents and things, and you have your home inspection, and invariably you find something that is unpermitted. Then the buyer has to decide at that moment, do they continue with the purchase, or do they say, well, I can clean that up, right? This is where you come to knowledge, and every violation or every unpermitted situation is different. So it's very complex, and I don't think that market has perfect knowledge.
Next question is for Clark, and my question is, if you have an older house and you need to upgrade the electricity, do you need a permit for that? And if so, will a permit to upgrade and make the electricity safe trigger a Prop 13 reassessment or not?
Okay, two questions. One is, yes, significant electrical work typically triggers a permit. There's no hard and fast clarity about that, right? You have someone come in and rewire a little something. If you ask, most likely with electrical, the answer is going to be yes, you need to pull a permit for that, but not always. The second part of that question is, once you've done that, does that trigger a reassessment? Mm-hmm. There are actually certain things that won't trigger a reassessment, and there are other things legally. For instance, if you, to use plumbing as an example, if you upgrade your plumbing from galvanized to copper, that increase in value, you're typically not looked at. This is assuming the assessor is reviewing those permits that specifically, which is a big assumption. You would not be, to the extent that that could be shown to increase the value of your house, you wouldn't be reassessed for that because it's a behavior they want to encourage. Solar panels, right? That whole process is its own fast track because society has decided that's a good thing to do. We're going to make that a better thing and not necessarily reassess. Now, any significant remodel that adds space, we'll just use that, right? Adds footprint to your house, requires a building permit. At that point, there's a reassessment made. But remember, the assessment's made based on that market. So this is where it's not necessarily the case that unless you completely rebuild, most of the value in the mountains is your particular spot in the mountains. Mm-hmm. So you have to remember that the building, I almost couldn't get financed on my house because my little house from 1927, the homestead, was such a small percentage of the total value of the property. It was all in the land.
Let me ask
incremental change.
I want to ask you a specific question about something I saw last week.
Mm-hmm.
I went down to a friend's house right on the water in Malibu, mm-hmm. and sort of was shocked to see the condition of this very small house. It was original construction from, I'm going to guess the 50s. I really don't know, but I was very surprised by the dilapidated look to this house, which sits on a piece of property that's got to be worth, I would say, a minimum of $10 million right on the beach in Malibu. So my question is, and then I learned also that the house was in the family for many years, and that this is probably why, because the children don't have the money to pay taxes in 2016 terms. So they're getting the benefit of the 1975 assessment, plus I guess 2% per year in most years. But if they were to just upgrade the electricity and upgrade the plumbing, would that trigger a reassessment of the value of the property or not?
At current level, right. So the increase in value attributed to that is, to my understanding, a basis for reassessment.
Wait, what does that mean, the increase in value?
Well, your house was worth X, right, based on your increase per year. So starting at whenever they inherited it, right, I imagine the value at that inheritance point is given, or in the case that it's been passed on, it's whatever that basis year was. Mm-hmm. It has been increasing at a maximum of 2% per year, and we're pretty close to that most years, except for 2010, where it went backwards and things like that. Assuming you get to that point, to the extent that the market will measure and it can be assessed that there has been an increase in value, that increase in value has to be taken into effect.
But I'm trying to,
But it's only at sale, but not to my knowledge. It's not like you say, okay, now you have a really, really small and really, really old and really, really bad house, but it's in Malibu, so you have to bring everything up to that value plus the increase in value.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the answer. I'm just trying to find out
Yeah.
whether the reason this house that I saw right in the beach in Malibu, whether the reason why it was so dilapidated was because they didn't want to upgrade the electricity or the plumbing or anything in the house because they were concerned about a reassessment.
More likely than that, the codes have moved much more in that amount of time than the assessment, Proposition 13 or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the codes have changed so that depending on how significant the upgrade they want to do, they will trigger requirements for everything else to be brought up to code.
So I guess my question to Clark is, if a house is older and the owner is concerned about the electricity doing something weird or maybe things getting hot or something like that, and they decide they want to get just the electricity upgrade, just that, can they do that? And if they get a permit just to upgrade the electricity, does it trigger a Prop 13 reassessment, or does it trigger other upgrades that are going to be required because they're upgrading the electricity?
Right. They can obviously deal with the safety issue and upgrade their electrical.
Without
the
a Prop
question
13 reassessment or with an assessment?
That depends on the specifics of the situation. If that electricity is going to an unpermitted space that never had an electrical permit to begin with, it's quite possible that that space needs to run through all the permitting processes.
Oh, okay.
There's the actual facts of the law and the regulations, and then there's the perception. Mm-hmm. And the problem in the west side of Los Angeles, in that example you're using on the coast, that there's several things going on there. One thing is that house sounds like a tear down. Well, the cost of construction in that location is truly exorbitant because of that zip code. So that's enough of a limitation depending on your income as well. They probably going to be, if they do any significant work there and they don't have a huge income to match their zip code, they're going to be selling.
I don't think the kids have ever worked.
Right.
I think because they inherited a house in Malibu from their parents and they got the benefit of paying almost no taxes on the house, they never really worked, and so no, there's no chance they're going to actually pay to upgrade the house. I don't think.
But the concern is, right, your concern is if you don't fix the electrical and it sets something on fire, that's bad for everybody, and that's very true. We need to have an approach to building and safety and inspections that prevents this cycle from being resold each time, and that's what happens. So, I realize this is a little off of your subject because it's never been resold, and it does have something to do with probably the tax of that, although that's a problem for the next buyer, who, by the way, in that zip code, that's a drop in the bucket, right? That increase in taxes. And it's known when you make the purchase, either you can afford it or not. But for the person who's living there, the real concern is that they don't upkeep their properties, and this is true all over the mountains, because of this perception that once you open the door to the authorities, it's almost like going back to the Dust Bowl years or something. They're going to come on in and they're going to take over, and you'll have no rights, you'll have no authority in the process, you can't say stop once they're there. Right. Some of that is founded in truth, a lot of it's not. But I think the solution to that is to allow things to go on to title. So if you invite someone in, we make it easy. We encourage people to build, rebuild, and repair well, and have inspections. One way to do that would be, if you do come on property, if I bought a house and I'm a layperson, I don't know that something here is not to code or is dangerous, I would like to know. That doesn't mean I would like to say, you better fix it within this many days or you're getting kicked out.
But it should affect the purchase price.
That's right. And so what you could do, which doesn't currently happen, is right now you'll get, the acronym is NOV, right? A notice of violation if they come on property. And this is randomly applied, by the way. But you'll get that. But if you got an NOPV, notice of potential violation, and that was recorded, right, at sale, the market, it would be right in your face, and the marketplace over time would take care of it.
Right. Well, so this is what I've seen, just my personal observation is that in the Malibu Hills, the vast majority of houses have unpermitted sections. Whether they build out the basement unlawfully,
I would agree with that.
or they're adding on bathrooms, what they call bootlegging bathrooms, bootlegging extra rooms in the house. And my concern is when someone is doing something unlawfully already, how do we know that the electricity and all that goes into constructing a new portion of a house is done up to code and by a certified, bonded electrician who's going to do it right? Because I've seen things in my neighborhood that I can tell by looking, and I'm no builder. It doesn't look right. The electrical outlets look wrong. They're doing funky things. They turn on and off.
Yeah,
and we're talking about the most flammable part of the world, pretty much.
Yeah.
So I guess my concern is, I mean, what's your response to that? This is, I believe it's happening because of Prop 13.
Yeah.
Because people in the area are paying taxes based on assessed value that is, $300,000 when the house is worth $1.5 million. So again, to avoid getting reassessed, they do things illegally, which puts us all at risk. I mean, isn't that a problem?
Oh, it's absolutely a problem. Again, is it a Prop 13 problem?
Well, what other reason can you think of for not getting a permit? Because to me, and the permits aren't that expensive. What's expensive is having your taxes going up dramatically by having your home value reassessed from $300,000 to $1.5 million.
That is spoken like, and I've heard you and Erwin going back and forth as attorneys, constitutional law, people are interested in propositions. I'm interested in what happens on the ground. What I can tell you is that, in point of fact, in fully permitted remodels, the reassessment has never been significant to the point where someone says, oh my God, I can't do that because my taxes went up. It doesn't, because the market is not properly valuing the difference between permitted and legal construction and unpermitted and illegal construction.
Wait, so
that's the basis of the problem, right? So the market, when it does get reassessed, yes, your value does go up.
But not to market value?
But it does to market value, but when it was crappy and illegal and unpermitted, its market value wasn't that much lower. You see what I'm saying? So that the market value, sure, over time, for those cases that people have stayed forever, it's going to be a bigger jump for them than someone who bought 10 years ago.
Well, let me ask a more specific question.
Yeah.
If you get new construction in your house it triggers a reassessment of the value of the house for tax purposes, do they do a realistic reassessment in terms of the comparables in the area, or do they just make up some number? Because it sounds like you might be saying that when you do get reassessed because of new construction, it doesn't actually go up to what the house would really sell for.
Anecdotally, it goes up to a percentage of what it would really sell for, but over the course of a normal length of home ownership, in which time people often buy with the intention, particularly in the old kind of Malibu and Topanga Hills kind of properties, they'll buy with the intention of remodeling, right? So it happens fairly quickly. So from their point of sale to the point of remodel, there's not that much difference.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, this is some of this is a little over my head. I don't know much about construction building.
But the point is, there's no tax bomb that people fear. There is a regulatory and a permit and a violation bomb that they fear, which is preventing them from doing things well. And to your previous question, that should concern people, because you do not know the nature of the construction you have, other than your home inspection report that you get, right? Unless the permit is a signal that at least that portion of permitted construction is done to the code requirements of that time.
Let me move on to another topic. And I'm sure you know why we have term limits, right? We have term limits because many, many years of social psychology and just reality and anecdotal examples show that when people are in the same spot for a long time, they tend to form liaisons that are not healthy for society. As Erwin talked about in the last show, judges can be bribed, and if they know someone for 20 years, they're more likely to take a bribe than someone they just met. So term limits have have a basis that I think makes a lot of sense. Now, when I apply that same idea to what happens in Prop 13,
you're going to go there
because the court, I have to go here. The court has said, well, we have
home limits.
There's a interest in preserving the neighborhoods. Okay, this is what I've personally seen. I've seen a lot of unhealthy and dysfunctional liaisons among homeowners in these areas, and I think it is because of Prop 13, and this is why. They all have dirt on each other. They all know that each other have done illegal build-outs of their basements. They have an illegal bathroom bootlegged on. And so what happens is they have these sort of unhealthy liaisons, if you will, to not tell on each other because, for example, in LA County, it's a complaint-triggered investigation.
That's
Unless someone
true.
complains about a bootlegged house or a built-out basement, they will not investigate. So the neighbors are all sort of, keeping tabs on each other, and they all have dirt on each other. So they'll have to, and then they form these liaisons, the same, like almost like voting packs that you see. And so what happens to a newcomer like me, or like my husband and me, is we don't know what's going on with these people, but there's some strange behaviors, and I think that's the downside. I realize the court said we want to preserve neighborhoods, but do we really want things to be stagnant? Do we really want people to form those kind of liaisons? Because that, I believe, is one of the ramifications of Prop 13.
I would agree that many neighborhoods, and probably this is true throughout time, exhibit unhealthy and problematic alliances that cause problems for other people in the neighborhood. That's kind of the history of settlement. The question is, if we altered, got rid of, abolished Prop 13, would that go away? In my anecdotal experience, professional experience in the mountains, I don't think it would make any difference, because what's really happening there, you're correct, it's a complaint-driven system now. The morass of regulatory material is such that the average person, average homeowner who wants to, maybe they're, a lot of people are I'm a professional, right? There's a small segment of the population that will hire someone like me to help them in most parts of the world and in the country even in the state. However, you have to in order to get through this stuff. So there's one barrier to entry for doing it right. Proposition 13 and the possible tax implications is in there, but it's part of a general morass. Now, here's the good thing about how the communities have adapted to that, right? So what happens is it becomes more local. So you have this huge complexity of state and local regulations, and then you have your neighbors. When someone crosses a line, it takes a lot in most neighborhoods, if you have good neighbor relations, for it to get to that point. But when it does, everyone has to fix it.
Probably the greatest concern I have with Prop 13 is that it sort of entrenches wealth among people who got to California first. It entrenches wealth in families. It makes it harder for young people to buy a house. It makes it harder for newcomers to buy a house. And I see it as a massive shift in wealth in favor of the wealthiest people, the people who already own homes in California, and a massive shift in wealth away from younger people, newcomers, people who don't make as much money, people who don't own houses yet. And I think that's sort of a really un-American and certainly un-Californian way of doing things. I mean, like I said, it's almost like a caste system. Like if you have a house now, you and your kids and their kids and all their kids, they'll all have money. But if you don't have a house now, you're going to be paying, in a sense, a disproportionate amount of taxes because, for example, the sales tax went up over 2% after Prop 13, as I think some way for the state to recoup some of the losses. So now all the people, all the little people, are paying more in sales tax, while the people who've already owned homes in California are paying relatively less taxes. And just what's your reaction to that? Because I know you're a long-term homeowner. I'm a newer homeowner. So, but I think even if I was an older homeowner, I would still feel this way. I just don't think it's right. I think that it should be more, that taxes should be more evenly distributed. I don't like the fact that the wealthiest in California are getting the biggest tax breaks under Proposition 13.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult for young people, new people to get into your typical Southern California housing market. I think there are many reasons for that. I think what I'm concerned about is let's make it possible for more people to both be college educated and buy a first home. Now, that being said,
Can you quickly tell us how you would do that?
how we would do that is not create a debt society at the level of education so that you have to choose between college or a house, right? It used to be you went to college in order to be able to afford a house. So again, Prop 13, I know we're trying to draw a line to that, but for me, that's stability. The market now knows it's going to cost me this much, and I got to scrape it together, and it's hard. I need young people to have more jobs, good jobs, and in places where the market allows them to buy in. That and I just don't see Prop 13 as that barrier to entry that you're seeing it.
Yeah.
Based on my experience.
Well, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Because I mean, we have low property taxes. We still have, right, we're among the lowest in the nation. The problem is maybe we shouldn't be funding education through property taxes. Right?
Okay. I think it's a matter of politics. Arnold Schwarzenegger said when Warren Buffett suggested repealing or reforming Prop 13, he said, quote, "I told Warren that if he mentions Prop 13 again, he has to do 500 sit-ups." And Jerry Brown said something similar. He said, quote, "Prop 13 is a sacred doctrine that should never be questioned." When I hear that, I think of the natural law arguments against abolishing slavery. It makes no sense. Why is it a sacred doctrine? Oh, because the wealthy then can re-entrench their wealth and not have to pay the same amount of taxes as newcomers. See, I'm hearing a lot of politics behind Prop 13 and not a lot of common sense. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, what's interesting is those two figures are, one is, right, I guess he was a moderate Republican. The other one is a fairly liberal Democrat. They're both saying it. So when you say it's politics, it's what politics? It may be the politics of the home.
Of
it really
staying in
hits
office.
people.
Or getting elected or getting reelected. And they actually
right.
said that
Yeah.
if you start messing with Prop 13, you will not get elected in California because they know the homeowners are more likely to go out and vote. And the homeowners are disproportionately in favor of Prop 13, and the renters are disproportionately not in favor of Prop 13, which makes sense.
And the problem is it's in a context of, even though we have very low property taxes, overall those same people are paying among the highest taxes in the country. Right, total.
Yeah.
So it's not, you can't separate it. So when you start attacking Prop 13, they're not assuming that other things are going to go down, even though with Prop 13 other taxes went up. They don't believe, and there's very little evidence, by the way, that this actually can happen, that if they adjusted for equity reasons, all the good arguments that people would make to change Proposition 13, that therefore their total tax burden wouldn't increase. They would just say, oh my God, my property taxes are going to
Let me run by a couple ideas I just came up with for reforming Prop
Sure.
13. I just thought about, okay, we're talking about people whose values of their homes have gone up so drastically that they're complaining about it. So their house went from a $200,000 value to $1 million value in a span of, 10 years? And they're saying, my house went up in value so much that I cannot pay my taxes. Now, wait a minute. First of all, if your house went up in value by $800,000, couldn't you get a home equity loan to pay your taxes? And couldn't the government give those home equity loans or something? I mean, isn't there a way of allowing taxes to be assessed against the wealthiest among us in California without running anyone out of their home, such as by a government giving a low-cost equity loan to pay your taxes, or even the government getting a lien against the home to pay the taxes that couldn't be paid by the current homeowner at the time of death or at the time of sale? I mean, isn't that a way of getting around, elderly people possibly losing their homes, but not having such an unequal taxing system?
Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion, and there are a number of ways that we could, if we brainstormed, could find a way to keep those who are on the fixed income, which, by the way, last time I looked at anybody's paycheck who had a job, their income's relatively fixed month to month. It's not like if you get a tax bill, suddenly you can go get more money, whether you're granny or whether you're a new homeowner, right? It's just not that easy. So let's just assume everybody doesn't want that instability. That being said, what you're really saying is, with your examples, is that it would be better to do this through another kind of government program than to have a market basis to work this out. And I think it would be fun to come up with ideas for this. My preference would be to have the real estate market be constructed in such a way, the regulation be constructed in a way that works itself out over time through the course of sale, and people can choose. I don't want to buy in this neighborhood.
Okay, and to be clear, I haven't talked to anyone who wants to see anyone lose their home over taxes. So that's not at all what I'm advocating, but I am advocating something to make the tax burden more fairly distributed among Californians and not so favorable to the wealthy, because it's hard enough to make it in this world. It seems to me that the younger people and newcomers should have a more fair portion of taxes being paid by them. You've been watching Meet the Professors. We've been talking about Proposition 13 in California. And please do subscribe to my YouTube channel and watch us on future shows.